Everybody, thanks so much for joining us. It's really terrific to have so many people signed up for this webinar. It's the top of the hour, so we'll start straight away. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and a huge welcome to you. We've got folks signed up from Australia and New Zealand, from Europe, from the States. It's the middle of the night for you guys, so we're going to keep it lively to keep you all awake. And from Benin, China, India, Nigeria, the Philippines. It's really terrific to have folks join us from across the world. I'm Jane Lewis. I'm one of the directors at the Centre for Evidence and Implementation based in London, and it's a real pleasure to be hosting this webinar. This is the 6th webinar that we've done as part of the build-up to the Evidence and Implementation Summit. We're recording this one, and we've recorded the other 5, and you'll find recordings from all of them on the eisummit.org website. The summit's going to take place in March. It's going to be a hybrid fun event, online activity, physical fun as well, with events based in Sydney and Melbourne, Singapore and London. And we're just surfacing at the moment from a terrific set of abstracts. We're building the programme. There'll be more information on it on the website in November. Early bird registrations close at the beginning of December, 8th of December, so do sign up. And in the meantime, these webinars are an opportunity to bring together policymakers, practitioners, organisational leaders, funders, researchers, innovators, to start conversations about the use of evidence. And today we're talking about what it means to use research evidence well in education, and how we move from quality evidence to quality use. It's a huge pleasure to welcome our 3 speakers. We've got Mark Rickinson, who's Associate Professor at the Faculty of Education at Monash University and has been working in this area for a long time and has a huge amount to say. Hi, Mark. We've got Jenny Donovan, who's the founding director of the National Evidence Institute. She was formerly a high school teacher. She's established and led a number of strategic initiatives to improve education, so she knows of what she speaks, and it's a great pleasure to have her here. Hi, Jenny. I hope you've been able to join us. We've had some minor IT issues just at the beginning, but I hope you're now with us. And we've got Robin Milden, who's the Executive Director of the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, and somebody with a huge amount of insight from across a range of different sectors about what it means to use evidence well in improvement. So hi, Robin, terrific to have you with us today. And how we're going to roll is that Mark will kick us off with a short talk and a rather fab set of slides. I might ask a couple of follow-up questions, but then I'll turn to Jenny and Robin to respond, to pick up on some of the themes in what Mark said, and to start to take the conversation forward. And then we'll move to questions. So please, as they're talking, post your questions in the Q&A chat box. In the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screens. And I'll call those questions out as we go. So please do start posting them there as soon as you want to, and use the chat function if you're having any kind of IT problems, and the lovely IT team at Monash University will sort you out. So Q&A for your questions, which we'll come to after we've heard from the 3 speakers. So over to you, Mark. Take it away. Look forward to hearing from you. Thanks everybody.
Thanks so much, Jane. And yeah, coming to you from Melbourne, Australia, I'd like to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm speaking to you from today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'd also like to say how grateful and pleased I am to be part of this conversation, and grateful to CEI, to Robin and Jane for allowing this to happen on this topic that's definitely close to my heart. Yeah, so this focus on what does it mean to use research evidence well it's important for two reasons. Firstly, it's important because I think there's a sense that when quality is discussed in relation to evidence use in education, it's almost always focused on the quality of the evidence, but very little about the quality of the use. Just think about the number of frameworks there are around quality of evidence standards, evidence hierarchies, etc., etc. There are many. There are very few equivalents for the quality of the use. Similarly, another issue is that there's a tendency to talk about whether we use evidence rather than how well we use evidence. So this webinar is about trying to sort of move the conversation from quality evidence to quality use, and from whether we use evidence to how well we use evidence. And all of those things are really integral to a project that I'm a part of here in Australia, which is a 5-year partnership between Monash University and the Paul Ramsay Foundation that's focused on, it's called the QURE project, and it's focused on improving the use of research evidence in Australian schools. And our first task in that work has been to try to better understand what it means to use research evidence well. And so we've analysed and synthesised research evidence from a number of different sectors: health, social care, policy, and also, of course, from education, in order to try and understand how have those sectors approached this issue of quality of use? Have they? And what can we learn for education? So I'm going to ask for the first slide to come up, which is basically our characterization of quality use of research evidence as a framework based on that analysis of the literature from different sectors. And I'll talk you through the framework. I mean, what we're saying is that we're trying to frame quality use in terms of thoughtful use, thoughtful engagement, and implementation of appropriate research evidence. So if we go to the next slide, at the core of this framework of quality use of research evidence are two aspirations, and those are for the research evidence to be appropriate and for the engagement and implementation to be thoughtful. Now, those are challenging issues, but we think they go to the heart of what it means to use research evidence well. So it's about the research evidence not just being methodologically rigorous, but also being appropriate for the context, and then the engagement with it being thoughtful. So I'll just give you a quote from a school principal who responded to a survey that we're doing with schools here in Australia, and she was saying that using research evidence well for them is about considering the context of the research and working out the extent to which the research applies to our local context and students. And you can tell that that issue of appropriateness is critical, and in order to be able to understand that, you need to engage thoughtfully. But the question is then, if those things are at the heart of quality use, well, what can help to enable those? And the way in which we're thinking about this is in terms of 3 levels or 3 layers of enabling. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start off with the individual enabling components. And those draw attention to not only the knowledge and capabilities or skill sets that are required to use evidence well, but also the dispositions and values, the mindsets with which we approach research evidence, and also the social, interpersonal, interactive dimensions of using research evidence well. Let me share another quote this time from a middle leader in a school here locally. And for them, using research evidence well was about keeping an open mind and not being biased, to not jump so quickly to agreeing or disagreeing with the research evidence, which really speaks to that middle mindset issue. But of course, in order to do that well, it's a team sport. We need to work together with others to have a shared deliberation. So if we move then to the organizational level, it's not just about, it's clearly a professional task, but if we move to the next slide that will flag up the organizational level, this shows us the importance of leadership, culture, and infrastructure. Now, none of these will be a surprise to probably anyone who's dialed into this webinar. You're all familiar with what change needs within an organization. but these come out very strongly as linked with quality use, in the sense that there needs to be organizational vision, but also role modeling of thoughtful use and selecting appropriate evidence. There also needs to be an organizational ethos and norms that support that. So we need to have a culture that's supportive of risk-taking, for instance, or that looks outwards as well as inwards for new ideas. And of course, infrastructure. Nothing happens without resources, time, support of that kind. Here's a quick quote from again from a middle leader in a high school, who talks about, in order to use research evidence well, all teachers involved in implementing a program or practice that's supposed to be informed by research evidence should have sufficient professional learning time allocated to read, review, and critically analyze that evidence. So there you see, it's not just about leadership, it's also about infrastructure. And if we just flick to the next slide, which takes us around to the system level influences, this is going to come up in our conversation. I know that Jenny and Robin will have great things to say on this, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but clearly nothing happens within a system which is unsupportive of thoughtful use and appropriate research evidence. So paying attention to that is clearly critical. So if we jump now to the final slide, and I know I've gone through these fairly quickly, this gives me a chance to flag up links to the two. If you want more information about the framework, there's a freely available resource report about the framework, which is the first reference there. And then there's a discussion paper which makes the links from the framework to health, social care, and policy, if you're interested in the kind of cross-sectoral ideas. This is also a chance for me just to acknowledge the fantastic input of my Q team colleagues. So Lucas Walsh, Connie Sacconi, Joe Gleason, Mandy Salisbury, and Kamal Darida, and Phoebe Marshall, all of whom have been critical to this work. I'll just conclude by saying two things. What I've outlined here is a conceptual framework. It's very much the start of a conversation, the start of a process. We're working hard now with teachers and school leaders and schools right across Australia to bring this to life, to understand what does quality use look like in different school contexts. What's involved in using research evidence well to tackle different kinds of educational challenges? What would a professional framework, not just a conceptual framework, but what would a professional framework look like to support quality use in schools? And of course, we're also looking at how can we turn this into capacity building interventions like professional learning and other processes to support system change and school change around quality use. But we think there's something in this framework in the sense that it's helping to flag up, more than anything, it flags up the professional nature of using research evidence well, and the way in which it really speaks to what it means to be an education professional, what it means to improve as a school, and what it means to improve as a system. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Jane, if that's helpful.
That's brilliant, Mark. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really, really stimulating. I love your very empowering take on the use of evidence, I think, really sort of foregrounding the importance of professional expertise, of the professional context of educators understanding about what it is they're trying to achieve and their use and application of research to those ends, which I think is really recognizing the insight that educational professionals bring to the process. And also I really love your emphasis on the humanness of the use of research, that it's not, it is a technical area, but it's not just a technical area. Yes. It's also about people, and it's about relationships, and it's about the dynamics between people. And I think those are such important thoughts to carry forward with us. Can I just ask you just a couple of sort of unpacking type questions? The first is, I mean, when you talk about quality use of evidence, can you just briefly say a bit about the sort of types of evidence that you have in mind?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Jane. Our focus is on research evidence as opposed to other forms of evidence, but that's not to negate the other forms of evidence. It's probably in response to the fact that, you know, certainly within Australia, and I think this is true in other contexts and jurisdictions, is that there's been a strong focus on building data literacy, let's say, in terms of analysis and use of data, but not so much around research literacy, analysis and use of research evidence. So our focus is on research evidence, and that might be research evidence that's generated by universities or research organizations, but it could also be research evidence that's generated with and within schools.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Okay, well that's brilliant, Mark. Thank you very much. So Jenny, I wanted to hand over to you first of all to ask you to respond and to sort of draw out some of the kind of themes that particularly interested you in what Mark had to say. Oh, you're just on mute at the moment, Jenny. Just need to unmute.
Of course.
Terrific.
The technological challenges are never going to let up. Thank you, Jane. And thank you, Mark. I do have lots of observations to make about the work. I think it's really fascinating. But I might start by saying I'm joining you this evening from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to traditional custodians and their elders. So the perspective I take to this is having undertaken a large consultation during the establishment phase of the new National Evidence Institute. And that's revealed two things to me. I think, firstly, there's a healthy regard for evidence and a high level of familiarity with the notion of using an evidence base to inform decision-making and practice. But there's a corresponding high level of uncertainty around what good means in relation to evidence quality and evidence use. So from my point of view, it makes my task both clearer, but also bigger than I think our country's education ministers may have foreseen when they decided, wouldn't it be great to have a National Evidence Institute and we'll get lots of new useful evidence. It's clear to me that we need both robust evidence and implementation of evidence if we're going to affect the desired improvement in student learning outcomes. So I probably disagree slightly with Mark. I don't think we're at the beginning of a conversation about evidence-informed practice in education in Australia. I don't think we are still debating whether the evidence should be considered. I think we're well and truly into the next stage. And the evidence for that is we've got a National Evidence Institute about to happen. The conversation now really needs to focus on the necessary conditions for evidence to lead to change. And this is why I really like Mark's conceptual framework. I think it acknowledges that we need to understand what quality use of evidence looks like, and it offers this comprehensive model of the interrelated factors. And I particularly like that it makes clear responsibility for this rests in more hands than just teachers. Figuring out what to do with evidence, how to learn from it, how to turn insights into action is not an easy task. So the work that Mark's leading with his colleagues in the QURE project reminds us that evidence changes nothing unless teachers are using it and changing what they're doing. The National Evidence Institute is certainly going to undertake research, and I foresee that it will play a role in improving access to high quality research evidence and enhancing the evidence base that we have about effective practices and programs. But I think that we're also going to be researching the emerging field that seeks to understand how do we successfully implement research evidence in education, and how do we need to support the kind of changes to thinking and changes to practice that this implies for teachers. I know that we can learn a lot from other fields and sectors, and that's why I'm really pleased to be wedged here between Mark and Robin on this panel, because they already have a lot of insight into the things that we can learn from other places. I do think that there'll be a particular challenge to move the dial from the conceptual to the specific, and I know Mark acknowledges this is very conceptual at the moment, but I guess I'm really keen to turbocharge that and get us stuck into actually doing the things that will make the difference. I think we need to understand at what point are teachers making the decisions that we might affect, and what is it that we serve up to them at that point, and in what form. Just another point, I guess, for the NEI is there's a real risk for us that teachers are going to be very wary that we're somehow existing to sit in judgment of them. You know, you need a National Evidence Institute because everything's broken. I don't think that's the case at all. And I'm really keen to establish from the outset that we intend to work with teachers and not dictate to them about what they ought to be doing and the way they ought to be doing it. So to the point you were just discussing with Mark about evidence and what we mean by it, I think we need to bring a very encompassing view of what we mean by evidence. Having a gold standard is very important, but it can leave the teachers feeling quite excluded and irrelevant. So I like the notion of evidences, if you like. It's not very elegant, but the sense that it's more than just research, it's more than just data, because I think that that's an idea that can help us describe evidence for teachers in a way that includes their own insights and their own professional experience. So if we can agree that evidence is that which gives us information and insight about something, then evidence can also be the experience of a classroom teacher, including their observations, their assessments. The question then to clarify is the level of confidence we can have about the evidence in that instance. The personal experience, the anecdote can be really useful prompts for a teacher who's making a decision in the course of a lesson, but maybe the teacher wants a higher level of confidence before deciding to replace explicit teaching with project-based learning. And a system leader will certainly want much more confidence about the standard of evidence before committing resources to a system-wide program. So part of the work of the NEI will be supporting teachers, leaders, policymakers to become more discerning. And I think Mark's framework anticipates that we be more thoughtful. I want to take us forward towards tackling those decision points and being ready with the right information at the right time in the right form. And over the longer term, I think we need to monitor that effort. I want to show that we're getting better at it. By we, I mean all of us involved in education, that the content is more context specific, that teachers' practice is more nimble and adaptive, and our understanding of what are the conditions for successful implementation of evidence-informed practice is robust. So I'll stop there, but I think we've got plenty of work to do.
Janie, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. So stimulating and inspiring. And I really love your emphasis on evidences, which really takes us back to the kind of original model of evidence-based medicine as being about the published evidence, professional insight, and also patient preferences, all coming together. And it's so important, I think, that we keep that very kind of wide framing on evidences. And I love your emphasis on the importance of context as well, which I'm sure is something that Robin will pick up on. Something we say all the time at CI, and everyone says is context is king, or context is queen, or whatever your non-binary royalty metaphor is. So that's terrific, Jenny. Thank you very much indeed. Robin, hand over to you for your thoughts on this. Again, yeah.
These guys set me up pretty nicely, and I want the people that have dialed in to know we did not do this, was not practiced. So I just want to kind of build on what both of you said, and sort of maybe throw a few kind of curveballs, maybe mainly towards you, Mark, just to keep it kind of, zesty. But couple of things I was thinking about, and it goes down to calling something a contextual framework. So in implementation science, we sort of talk about there's conceptual frameworks, which is, granted, Mark, that's absolutely what you're working on. So it's using theories and research to kind of hypothesize and test what seems to be kind of enabling and predicting implementation and what seems to be getting in the way. And that was really nicely kind of, shaped together. And then sometimes people talk about implementation frameworks, and implementation frameworks are kind of defined as the phases of implementation that people often need to go through to go from sort of an idea into, full and effective implementation. And by effective implementation, we generally mean this new innovation, the program, the policy, the research, whatever it is, goes from new to business as usual, that it's implemented of a high quality, often built into the way things happen. And that's quite a sort of journey to get there. And frameworks, not only do they include the idea of phases of what you need to go through, but it also has common steps within those phases that the implementation science literature say your best bets are to try and tackle some of these. So that would be an example of doing a needs assessment of what's actually needed within any site that you're doing an implementation effort. It would be an understanding of what then the science and best practice says about that. Then I'm interested, Mark, and I'll come back to you, adaptation for context is a really hot topic in implementation science. It is, like Jane said, context is king no matter what. And particularly in a country like Australia and the UK. And if we don't enable, when we're sending out, when we're helping people understand what research evidence and other types of evidence says to figure out what we want to do to try and achieve the outcomes we're trying to achieve, we have to give some guidance on what are the must-haves, but what are the things that people can adapt? Because it's a little bit about fit for context, right? So, and I just wanted to, I'll give you a hint that I'm interested in hearing a little bit about that, because it is a very common step that you need to think about. And one of the issues we see when people try to implement evidence-informed practice or programs or innovations, and even then scale, it's quite a challenge if we're not thinking about that adaptation, careful adaptation for context and culture. And so I was sort of looking for a little bit of that, which is quite common. Other common things are, I've noticed how many times we've referred to as teachers, and one of the things implementation science has helped us understand that, and I'm not saying this is what we say, because Jenny, you really nicely summarized it towards the end of what you were saying, but we need to go beyond. Our main implementation effort is teaching or training teachers as the sole strategy for getting something implemented well. The education literature was one of the first and early areas to show how important a training plus model is, how important that some sort of in situ coaching, supportive coaching, and help to implement new practices in the setting really does accelerate our ability to get to effective implementation. And we now apply that in all sorts of other areas of work that we do. And so we'd argue that without a training plus model, we're going to be in a little bit of trouble. Also, the enabling, teachers are really busy, so are school leaders, so are policymakers. We've done a lot of work supporting schools in a number of different contexts to use implementation science to kind of drive more effective implementation. One of the toughest things is they're just so busy. And to go back to implementation being a team sport, one of the things we know can be an effective implementation strategy is to form implementation teams and have those teams working together to sort of figure out what needs to change, both within the evidence-informed practice and within the setting to enable better implementation. It's really hard to get time out of the classroom. Like it's a whole, in all the implementation projects and work we've ever done, I find early childhood schools very particular settings to be thinking about what needs to be adjusted in terms of your implementation strategies to be able to do that. So you've sort of got your what, which is your evidence and your research, but you've got your how. I'll just say two more things and I'm going to stop talking. So just thinking about how do you adapt what we know works in implementation science for the setting. So in addition to implementation frameworks, what is a really hot topic in implementation science is implementation strategies. So there's over 80 known documented implementation strategies in the literature that you can apply in any implementation effort. It can go from funding to training, because you need that, to a training plus model in whatever way you can do it. Some in situ coaching, there's data, there's teaming structures, and I feel like I've said this on almost every webinar, but a good colleague of ours, Byron Powell in the US, has done a really good job helping categorize and define what these implementation strategies. I think they're sort of a missing piece in the puzzle as well, because you've got your what, but then you've got your how. And another sort of hot topic in implementation science is how low can you go? What's the least amount that we can put in place to get the effect we're looking for? Because systems we aren't going to be able to take on really big implementation infrastructure. It's just not sustainable and not possible in some areas of Australia or the UK. And then my last point is this, there's a really interesting movement in implementation science around what are the capabilities and competencies you need to work and use implementation science, knowledge mobilization, I'm aware it's referred to sometimes in the UK, research translation, however we want to term it. we're now starting to understand more and more, what do people need to be able to enable and work with systems to help create that change? What are the competencies, skills, and knowledge that they need to do that? And it needs to be some knowledge with the innovation, but there's this great, one of our favorite frameworks called the Paris framework, which I think it's because it says the Paris framework seems romantic, by a very good colleague of ours in the UK, and she's been studying, Joe Rycroft Malone, she's been developing and using the Paris framework, the conceptual framework, again, Mark, for a really long time. One of the major contributions she made was she actually studied the effect of quality facilitation of implementation teams and the extent to which that achieved better implementation. And it is an evidence-based implementation strategy, really. And then she was able to kind of categorize what that looked like, so then you can train to it. So I'd sort of, and I think because our bias at CI is we work a little bit more on the action, you know, in the frameworks than the helping people use them in the team. So just to add, and I've said 1,000 things. So Mark, what do you think? Tell me.
As always, Robin, 101 ideas. Look, no, what you've said is very helpful. I mean, there's no question there are rich pickings and rich learnings to be had from implementation science. And I would say, you know, that hasn't happened enough within education. But rightly you say that some of the really interesting early work was done within education. It's always important to remember that. Yeah, I mean, I think the issue of contextualizing, you know, and kind of what can you tweak, what do you have to hold true to, all of those sort of, I mean, those will be and are within our thinking for sure around quality use of research evidence and implementation science, and some other kind of behavior insights, behavior change is helpful in relation to that, and I think very important. And I think that will be something where, you know, to an extent, practice often leads theory as well in these areas where there's phenomenal, sophisticated implementation happening, you know, within schools and within systems. It may not necessarily be termed in those ways. So I think there's a lot of, you know, it's on our radar. It's definitely part of our thinking, and it will become more important the closer we get to practice, you know, away from the conceptual. The other point that really resonated in what you said, Robin, was around the tendency to default to training and the need for training, plus the need for not just, you know, for the implementation strategy, so the how, not just the what. And, you know, I think within education, there is a tendency to reach for something educative as an intervention first up. Now that can be, you know, kind of ad hoc training or very sophisticated professional learning, but still it's using a particular way of, and, you know, we're working closely with BehaviourWorks Australia, that behavioural researchers within the QURE project, and often they're asking us, you know, how sure are you that professional learning is the way to build capacity for quality evidence use, you know? And so it's really trying to drill down what are the challenges that that school leaders, that middle leaders, that intermediaries and that teachers and, you know, different players in the system are experiencing, and what can help to bring that about. And I think, you know, the sorts of frameworks that you mentioned that we're well aware of, there's a whole plethora of possibilities. And it's about, you know, in the same way that you select research methods for different kinds of research questions, you need to, you know, choose interventions depending on the nature of the problem. So, yeah, I mean, really helpful.
That's brilliant, Mark. Thank you. Thank you very much. And folks, there's some really good questions coming in. Do please keep them coming in the Q&A channel at the bottom of your screens. But Jenny, I just wanted to pick up to sort of continue this issue, this discussion about context, just to pick up on the points that you made about the importance of really understanding the decision points for which people in the education system are going to be wanting to use evidence, because that seems to me to be such an important sort of part of the context of evidence use, and important for thinking about how we adapt and apply evidence. Can you just say a bit more about the kinds of decision points that you think are critical and where you think the Institute will be focusing?
I'm kind of interested in the point that Robin was just making about capability, because I think, yes, it will be important to understand the capability and whether teachers have the skill set they need to be able to embrace evidence and implement practice. But I think you also want to be certain they've got the motivation, that they are inclined to do it because they see it as worthwhile trying to improve their practice, or they accept that there are things that they do that aren't having the outcomes they wish they were effecting. So I think there's a point at which a teacher as a professional reflects on their practice and thinks, I've been doing this, it's not working for that child or that group of children, or I'm not covering that topic, they're not doing as well on my assessments or whatever, therefore I need to think about doing things differently. If you can engage people at that point where they're inclined to embrace a change, then you've got your big opportunity to kind of move in and offer them something that will work for them. The other point about context, and we heard it a lot in the consultation, because the consultation that I did wasn't just talking to ministers and heads of department, it was teachers as well. It was a large number of focus group testing and asking questions of teachers. Their sense was they understand there's a lot of research out there about education. They describe themselves as drowning in research. They don't want to know any more research. They feel like too much of the research available to them is derived from offshore. What they would like is research and information about evidence-informed practice that speaks to them in their particular context with their particular challenge. So I'm a teacher of Year 8 science. Don't come and tell me I ought to be doing cognitive load. Tell me what that looks like in my Year 8 science classroom. Can you help translate that into what does it mean in practice? So I guess that's a couple of different angles on context, but I think it's all about understanding the teacher. And to go back to another point that Robin made, recognizing the busyness. You know, this my whole enterprise is about encouraging teachers to change. What's the thing teachers are most weary of, most exhausted by? Change. So it's understanding that we've got to figure out the way of getting the message to them, building up the capability, boosting the motivation, seizing the opportunity, making sure it's the right resources at the right time, they're engaging, accessible, etc., all at once, or it's all for naught.
Jane, can I make a comment on that quickly? Just I'll just add to that, and I'll come back to something you said. The other way to, I think sometimes we need to tackle it is, there are often, if you do a structured or semi-structured assessment of barriers and facilitators to implementation, which health is very good at, and implementation science has a longer history than the rest of us in early childhood parenting, child welfare, education, where they have a history of actually assessing in some structured way what's getting in the way and what's helping implement something, and then use that to develop a plan. So at CEI, we're very, very influenced by that work and do that more and more. Often the barriers aren't the human beings, like the teachers, that need to do the thing. It's the organizational stuff around them that is getting in the way of them accessing, using, learning how to use, building into their current teaching practice that gets in the way. And so we try to get some quick wins by attempting to address some of those other organizational and contextual barriers, to just take the pressure off, because we've got a history in education and human services as our major strategy of doing major service and implementation reform is always the front line. And there's nobody else has to do anything else different behind them. I'm exaggerating for point, but it's sort of, and that front line, they're already really, really busy. You think social workers, teachers, early childhood practitioners, like there's a lot going on. So it's kind of acknowledging, and that's where Mark, your framework's really kind of helping to remind people of that there's the individuals, there's the organization, and there's the context, and all of those things play a part in whether something is implemented and scaled or not. And we do have, as implementation specialists, ability to try and influence things around that. The second point, Jenny, you hit on a nice little evidence-informed piece and implementation science around motivation. And people often get a little bit worried when we start talking about motivation, because it can be seen as a bit of a negative thing, like, well, you're not motivated to this new thing, so you're not. Now, there's these great colleagues of ours in the US that publish all over the place around trying to understand how to improve both people and setting readiness to implement the new thing. And that's often defined by three things: motivation, knowledge and expertise with the innovation and evidence-informed practice itself, and organizational capacity. I'm not going to say capability, capacity and infrastructure to be able to do that. And I don't mean motivation like they're not, but there's a human part to this, as both of you have already brought out already, which is if we're introducing something, if something's being introduced new to a setting, and this person is in their head thinking, you know what, that thing I was doing before was better than what this new thing is they're getting me to do, so I'm going to stick with that because I've been doing that for a while. I mean, they'll just keep implementing that, and maybe that is okay, and we don't have any really good evidence the thing that they weren't doing was okay. So this is kind of helping people begin in a different position to be able to change, but also making sure that people understand the innovation and the organizational setting. So it's just taking the pressure off the front line a little bit, because it is a major barrier.
That's really helpful, Robin, and I want to pick up on some of the great questions that are coming through, and first of all, one that I mean, you've really helpfully there highlighted, Robin, the importance of the organizational setting that practitioners are working in, but what about the wider system as well, because similarly that can be a massive constraint on the use of evidence, or it can be a real enabler. So there's a question about, we found that the interactions between the different levels of your model are key: teacher, school, system. Could you say a bit more about that, please? So can we talk a bit more about what are the elements of the wider system that are essential? Where are they reasonably well aligned with the use of evidence, and where do we really need to focus our attention? Jenny, I imagine that this is quite an important part of the work that the Institute will have in mind. Do you want to kick us off with thinking about which parts of the wider system are key?
Look, to be frank, I'm wrestling with that at the moment, because I won't have the levers to accelerate the impact of enhancing evidence-informed practice that are available to systems and sectors. So I can make content attractive, I can build a beautiful website, I can translate research so that it's context relevant, create infographics, podcasts, emails, post-hardcover. I can do all of that stuff, but I can't wield the systemic levers. I can't offer professional learning credit towards a teacher's professional accreditation. I can't ordain that schools should use their release from face-to-face or their pupil-free days to engage with research or practice new techniques. I can't incentivise the use of evidence-informed practice in whole school improvement programs. These are the levers that are available to the systems, but not to me where I sit. What I need to do is get to the system leaders to say, these are the things worthwhile doing because you have those levers available to you. I do think, though, that to come back to your earlier question about context, at the school level, leadership has a lot of levers available to them, and the task of the school leader to reflect on the responsibility they have for the motivation question, the capability question, the culture, the plan, the vision of the school, and the practices relating to professional learning, etc. They all lie within the remit of a school leader. So there's a lot that can be happening there, and we'll certainly be making school leadership a target audience for our work.
Mark, do you want to come in on this issue of the wider system, and from your perspective, the kind of key aspects of that need to be considered, recognising the difficulties that Jenny highlighted?
No, absolutely. I'm glad to hear that Jenny's grappling with this just as much as the Q team is. So that's reassuring, Jenny. But look, I mean, something that's been really helpful actually in relation to sort of the system level influences, and it was a conversation with Jonathan Sharples at the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, work that himself and David Goff had done. And it was really just saying there's a danger in relation to evidence use and evidence-informed practice of focusing a huge amount on the idea of the evidence ecosystem and getting all the sort of, the knowledge generation, the knowledge translation, and the knowledge, trying to get it all aligned and working. And you sort of take your eye off the broader education system, the accountability, all of the, many of the things that Jenny just mentioned, and others, which can be actually much more challenging. It's almost the point that Robin was making about, you can focus on the front line and forget the broader organizational. So I think, there's something really important about thinking beyond the evidence ecosystem, which I know, is a very simple thing to say. It doesn't really provide us any answers, but it's I don't know, I've just thought more and more about it, and I think it is significant. The other point that's, I don't know, it's come up in our team as we've been starting to think more about evidence-informed practice in a context like Australia, a sort of complex federal system with lots of different sectors, lots of different states, lots of different kind of players and levels, is that there's a sort of, there's a kind of, there can often be an aspiration to greater alignment within all of this complexity. And actually, I think we need to think about where are the productive spaces within the complexity. For instance, where is, kind of autonomy is a very common kind of approach within many jurisdictions, school autonomy. But where is that autonomy focused on professional autonomy as well as, or instead of, structural autonomy, in the sense that there's actually some kind of control over how you work as a professional, and because that's a space where there's more capacity and scope, and perhaps also motivation for quality evidence use. So thinking about the system, both sort of the evidence ecosystem, but also the stuff beyond, importantly the stuff beyond, but also thinking about where are the productive spaces within the particular system that you're operating within.
I think that's a lovely, lovely concept, Mark. Really, really important point. There's another question here, which is picking up on the importance of school culture. So teachers are weary of change. What the QURE project is clarifying is what improving schools offer is the culture that includes the enabling components, which builds the increasing business as usual level of practice. So, what do you each think are the important features of school cultures, and what are the approaches to incentivizing, supporting, building, rewarding those? Robin, do you want to kick off on that one? Perhaps drawing on cultures in other contexts as well.
I really don't, but I will. I thought you got a Mark first. Culture and climate is in the implementation science literature very also hot topics. There's cultures that enable the use of evidence and best practice and adaptation, and there's cultures that get in the way. I think often of the leadership literature, which isn't overly empirical, it isn't overly scientific, but there are emerging studies showing certain leadership behaviors which enable a culture of being curious, a culture of accepting differences, a culture of allowing research evidence to be available and thought about, a culture of ongoing professional development, not one-off training events. This kind of best practice, Center for Excellence type approach does enable effective implementation of evidence and practice. There's also how organized a organizational setting is versus some level of chaos. So I know there's classic studies from Maureen Dobbins, who I adore, who showed that the function of a knowledge broker, which is someone who can translate research and evidence and can kind of live in the research world but understands the context, it's a very effective implementation strategy in health systems where the culture is not very friendly to the use of evidence and they're quite chaotic, as in high staff turnover, no real attention to using research or the latest research evidence, no attention to letting that be adapted for context. Knowledge brokers were really effective there. they didn't make much of a difference in settings where the culture was very, very, open to questioning, use of research, strong leadership behavior. So it definitely does play a part. I think the challenge with culture is we've got to make it a little bit concrete, because I think we start to lose policymakers and practitioners when we start talking about organizational culture, and they're like, okay, where are they? Are they organizational consultants coming in? Where are they? So I just think we need to let the science kind of catch up and just be quite practically applied. But
that's brilliant. Thanks, Mark. I wanted to give you a breather, but what are we learning from the QURE project about school cultures? And there's also, just looping in another lovely question, which is about what insights you have from your work on the mechanisms for nurturing individual skill sets and mindsets. And perhaps you could talk about that at the same time as talking about school cultures. I think the 2 points are quite well linked.
Yeah. Well, look, two messages which are coming through very strongly from our initial surveys of, around about 500 educators across 4 states, is the importance of a culture that encourages and supports risk-taking and experimentation. And, that speaks to the role of the system, and that kind of, with autonomy comes accountability. And, a culture that can kind of foster and support and encourage risk-taking is something that's come through really strong. It's been articulated in very different ways, but that's a core theme. Another one is this is easy to overlook, and it speaks to the kind of the social relational dimensions of using research evidence well, and that's the importance of staff being involved in the process, it not just being something which is decided by leadership and then kind of implemented by leadership or, through staff, but is that, because we've asked educators around both to say, what does using research evidence well look like, but also what does using research evidence poorly like? And lots of the non-leadership responses, i.e. teachers or support staff who have responded to the survey around using research evidence poorly, flag up things like, well, leadership, cherry pick certain pieces of evidence and then we just have to implement it, etc., etc. So that's something around involvement. Now, the second question was about kind of what can help in terms of building individual skill sets and mindsets.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big that's a question we're really grappling with. We don't know. I mean, the obvious thing is to say, look, this is it's a professional learning issue, and you need training in this, training in that. But it's more complex than that. I mean, it goes back to Robin's point about all of the different kind of implementation strategies and the different capabilities, and Jenny's point about really trying to understand the decision points. And I really don't think we're there yet, to be honest. So I'm going to just say that, which is a really annoying researcher's response. But sorry.
No, well, that's cool. Honesty and transparency is always important. But I mean, Jenny, this seems to me to pick up on a point that you made earlier about the importance of recognising research and evidence that's generated within schools as being a really important part of the evidences that schools need to draw on. And I've always found the actual doing of research to be an important way of helping practitioners and organisations to really develop that kind of curiosity mindset and that kind of questioning approach. Can you say a bit more about where you see the importance of schools doing and using their own data and their own research?
Yes, with some trepidation, because I don't want the schools to come away from this with the message that we've got yet another thing we want them to do and I'm about to send them out a whole lot of work. It's not like that. It's more about perceiving that teachers and schools and school leaders, I'm not seeing them as being consumers of a product we're going to create. I see them as being partners in the quest for better evidence-informed practice and more successful implementation. Because I know they're already doing a lot of stuff in their schools. Mark mentioned one of the aspects of a healthy culture is a school with an experimental mindset. They've got the kind of predisposition to try things out and run the risk that they might get it wrong. When he was talking then, I was reflecting on some of the most effective principles I know, one in Victoria, a couple in New South Wales, and this is absolutely the way they roll in their schools. And they're not, as instructional leaders, they're not the experts. In each of the 3 cases I have in front of mind, they've totally delegated to the people who have expertise, who are really motivated, really done their homework, done the extra course, whatever. And the principals have stepped back and said, these people are going to tell us about this, and they're going to take us on this journey towards finding out whether it's the right thing for us. The other thing that they have is the kind of internal theory of change. They know what it is they're pitching for. It's invariably improved learning outcomes. So if the thing they tackle doesn't affect improved learning outcomes, then it's not working for us and we back away. And a good leader recognizes that point, embraces the fact that it didn't work, doesn't always, and stops the thing that doesn't work. And I think in a lot of places, in a lot of organizations, in a lot of systems, we're really bad at stopping. We pile new stuff on and we don't just eliminate the stuff that's gone wrong. I feel like I drifted a bit on your question then, but I was carried away with my vision of the principals who are so fabulous. If we could just kind of bottle them and put them in the drinking water, everything would be fine.
Absolutely. And I've always found that the people who seem to be really inspirational around organizational change and around improvement in the use of evidence as part of that are the people who absolutely have the needs and the outcomes of the children or families or whatever that they're working with absolutely at the center of their work and their heart, and that's their driving force. I'm just going to go to one final question before we wrap, just perhaps for quite a quick answer, which is about great presentation, Mark. You broke down appropriate evidence as being of high methodological quality and appropriate for practice. Are there additional factors such as the accessibility of the evidence or how actionable it is, and perhaps also about how well it fits with the actual needs of teachers that we should be picking up on? Let's not leave researchers off the hook and put the focus too much on schools. Mark, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely Steve Higgins, an evidence use researcher in the UK, has got a nice model with, I think it's 6 A's, you know, that sort of characteristics of evidence that are helpful for effective use. And I'm guessing this question is picking up on that, because actionable and appropriate is one of them. Yeah, for us, picking up on the appropriateness felt like the most, you know, you really, when you're thinking about quality, and you have to choose your adjectives carefully. And so, and appropriate felt like the kind of the most important catch-all one, you know, in the sense that it's not just rigor, it's also appropriateness, because that connects with context and, you know, both for issue, for setting and for students. But yeah, I mean, clearly things need to be accessible. They also need to be actionable. They, you know, there are other qualities that are needed as well. I think those come into the thoughtful implementation, actually, is because you need to turn, but I don't think you'd want to select evidence because it was actionable. The most important thing is to have something that's appropriate, and then you work out how to enact within, and how, you know, how to integrate it with professional expertise within a specific context. So that would be my quick response to that.
I think that's brilliant, Mark, and that I think just really makes us think about evidence as being in service to practice, which is something that we often say about implementation science. It's not evidence for its own sake, it's in service to practice and improvement. Folks, sadly, I think that's all we've got time for. We've got shed loads of other fab questions that we could spend another hour talking about, but we need to wrap. So just first of all, a huge thank you to Mark and Jenny and Robin for really inspiring, thoughtful, insightful words today. And a massive thank you to everybody for participating and for your questions, which have really driven the session and been enormously helpful. Thank you so much for joining us. You'll find there's lovely feedback coming through on the chat and Q&A as well. You'll find a recording of this and the other webinars on the eisummit.org website, and you can sign up there to join us at EIS around the world. Early bird registration finishes on the 8th of December, so sign up by then. And then just finally, have a wonderful evening, have a great dawn, have a great day, wherever you are. And thank you again so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you.